The most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan didn't have a sign. It didn't need one. If you belonged at Ristorante Vecchio, you knew where it was. If you didn't belong, no sign in the world would help you. The building sat on a quiet corner of the Upper East Side, its facade the color of aged cream, its windows glowing with the warm light of crystal chandeliers and old money. Politicians dined here. Hedge fund managers closed deals over the osso buco. And once, according to whispered legend, a president had proposed to his future wife in the private room upstairs. Gianna Moretti had worked here for 3 years, and she still felt like an imposter every time she walked through the service entrance. She'd grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Bensonhurst, raised by a grandmother who spoke more Italian than English, and cooked meals that could make grown men weep with joy. She'd put herself through community college waiting tables at diners and pizza joints, dreaming of something better without ever believing she'd find it. Then, through a connection of someone her grandmother knew from church, she'd gotten an interview at Vecchio. And somehow, impossibly, she'd gotten the job. 3 years later, she still couldn't quite believe it. Tonight was like every other night. Controlled chaos in the kitchen, studied elegance in the dining room, the constant ballet of service that made the impossible look effortless. Gianna moved through the room with practiced grace, refilling water glasses and clearing plates, invisible in the way that good servers learn to be. The wealthy didn't want to see you. They wanted their needs anticipated before they knew they had them, their glasses filled by unseen hands, their world maintained by people who didn't exist until they were needed. She'd learned to be a ghost. It paid well enough to cover her grandmother's medications, the blood pressure pills, the arthritis cream, the sleeping aids that Nonna Clara insisted she didn't need but couldn't sleep without, and keep the heat on in winter. It wasn't the life she dreamed of as a little girl, watching old Hollywood movies with her grandmother and imagining herself in ball gowns and champagne. But dreams were expensive, and Gianna had learned early that survival came first. Everything else was luxury. The man in the corner booth was new. She'd noticed him the moment he walked in. It was impossible not to. He moved through the room like he owned it, which, given Vecchio's clientele, he very well might. Tall and lean, with dark, wavy hair touched by silver at the temples, and the kind of angular features that photographers loved. High cheekbones, straight nose, a jaw that could have been carved from marble. His suit probably cost more than her annual salary, but he wore it like an afterthought, comfortable in his wealth in a way that only people born to it ever managed. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Dark, penetrating, holding depths that seemed to swallow the light, and sad. Profoundly, achingly sad in a way that his composed expression couldn't quite hide. He sat alone, which was unusual for Vecchio's clientele. Men like him usually came with entourages, assistants and bodyguards, and beautiful women draped on their arms like accessories. But this man had a table for one, and he sat facing the door with his back to the wall. And something about the way he held himself suggested he was used to watching for threats. Nina appeared at Gianna's elbow, her thin face pinched with the perpetual dissatisfaction that defined her. "Corner booth," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to get his drink order 3 times. He just waves me away like I'm a fly. Maybe he's waiting for someone." "For an hour?" "He's been sitting there staring at nothing for an hour. Ordered wine, hasn't touched it, hasn't even looked at the menu." Nina's lip curled. Probably one of those miserable rich bastards who gets off on making the help feel small. Gianna glanced at the man again. He was staring at his wine glass now, turning it slowly between elegant fingers, lost somewhere far away from the gleaming restaurant around him. "He doesn't look mean?" she said quietly. He looks sad. Nina snorted. Sad? Sure. He's got a $10,000 watch and a private table at Vecchio, and he's sad. Cry me a river. She grabbed a tray of dirty glasses and stalked toward the kitchen. I've got real problems. He can wallow in his champagne tears alone. Gianna should have let it go. Should have minded her own business, kept her head down, stayed invisible. That was the rule at Vecchio. Don't engage, don't personalize, don't care. The guests weren't people. They were tables. Table 12 needs more bread. Table 7 wants the check. You didn't wonder about their lives or their sorrows or the shadows behind their eyes. But something about this man, this stranger in his beautiful suit with his untouched wine and his devastating loneliness, tugged at something inside her, a thread of recognition maybe, a kindred grief she couldn't quite name. He reminded her of her grandfather in the months after Nonna had her stroke, the way Papa Giovanni would sit at the kitchen table for hours, staring at nothing, present in body but absent in every way that mattered, lost in a grief too big to share, too deep to explain, too heavy to carry alone. She'd been 14 when she'd found him crying in the dark at 3 a.m, and she'd never forgotten the sound, a grown man sobbing like a child, broken by a love that had outlasted everything except his own heart. She found herself at the server station, watching the man in the corner booth without meaning to, and the words came out before she could stop them. Italian words, the real Italian her grandmother spoke, not the textbook phrases she'd learned in school, thick Sicilian dialect, the language of her childhood, of Sunday dinners and whispered prayers and love that didn't need translation. Povero uomo, she murmured. Guarda I suoi occhi. Un uomo con occhi tristi, come qualcuno che ha perso tutto e sta ancora cercando. Poor man. Look at his eyes, a man with sad eyes, like someone who's lost everything and is still searching. Cosa? Nina had reappeared, frowning. Niente. Gianna shook her head. Nothing. Just thinking out loud. In Italian? What are you, a tour guide? Nina grabbed a bottle of wine from the station. Whatever. Table 4 needs a refill. Try not to fall in love with any more sad billionaires. She swept away, and Gianna turned back to check on the corner booth. The man was looking at her. No, not looking. Staring. His wine glass was frozen halfway to his lips, red liquid trembling against the crystal, and his dark eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. As she watched, he inhaled sharply and choked. Wine splashed across the white tablecloth as he coughed, one elegant hand pressed to his chest, his composure shattered for the first time since he'd walked in. Gianna moved without thinking. She crossed the dining room in quick, quiet steps, grabbing a clean napkin from an empty table as she passed, and arrived at his booth just as he was regaining control. Sir, are you all right? Can I get you some water? He looked up at her, and up close the sadness in his eyes was even more devastating. But there was something else there now, something that looked almost like wonder. You speak Italian, he said. His voice was low and smooth, with the faint trace of an accent she couldn't quite place. Yes. She felt heat rise to her cheeks. My grandmother. She raised me. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Did you hear, un uomo con occhi tristi? He repeated her words back to her, and the way he said them, soft, almost reverent, made her heart stutter in her chest. A man with sad eyes. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and never be seen again. She'd broken every rule, committed the cardinal sin of making a guest feel observed, and now he was going to complain to management, and she was going to lose her job and her grandmother's medications and everything she'd worked for. Sit down. The words were gentle, a request, not a command. Please, just for a moment. I can't. I'm working. I'll get fired. You won't. Something flickered in his eyes, a hint of steel beneath the sorrow. I promise you won't. Please, He trailed off, looking down at his wine-stained napkin. No one has seen me in a very long time. Not the way you just did. Against every instinct, against every rule, against every screaming warning in her head, Gianna Moretti slid into the booth across from the most dangerous man in New York. She just didn't know it yet. His name was Luca. He told her that much as she perched on the edge of the velvet seat, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. Just Luca. No last name, no title. Nothing that would identify him to anyone who might be watching. Just a first name offered like a gift, like a secret, like the first tentative step across a bridge that might or might not hold their weight. They talked for 7 minutes. Later, Gianna would remember every second of those 7 minutes with perfect clarity. The way his hands moved when he spoke, elegant and expressive in the Italian way her grandfather had always gestured, and the brief flickers of warmth that broke through his sadness when she made him almost smile. The way the candlelight caught the silver in his hair. The way his voice dropped when he spoke of his mother, soft and reverent and aching with a loss that time hadn't healed. He asked about her grandmother, about the Italian she'd learned at Nonna Clara's knee, the dialect that was dying out as the old generation passed and the young ones forgot, traded their heritage for assimilation, and left the old words to gather dust in memories no one would inherit. He spoke it back to her, the same rough, beautiful Sicilian that had been the soundtrack of her childhood, and something in her chest cracked open at the sound of it. My mother spoke like that, he said, his voice distant, before she died. I haven't heard it in, he shook his head, a long time. I'm sorry. Don't be. He met her eyes, and for a moment the mask slipped completely. You just gave me a gift I didn't know I was missing. A sound from across the room, the manager's voice, sharp and questioning, snapped Gianna back to reality. She was supposed to be working. She was sitting in a booth with a customer. She was going to lose everything. I have to go. She scrambled to her feet. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. This was inappropriate. Gianna. He said her name like he was tasting it, reading it from the tag on her blouse. Will you be here tomorrow night? Yes, I work every night except Sunday. Then I'll see you tomorrow. It wasn't a question. It was a promise, delivered with the quiet certainty of a man accustomed to the world bending to his will. She fled to the server station, her heart hammering, her face flushed, absolutely certain she'd made a terrible mistake. But when she glanced back at the corner booth, Luca was watching her go with something in his eyes that looked almost like hope. The next night, he was there again. Same booth, same untouched wine, same sad eyes that lit up the moment she walked into his line of sight. This time, he'd ordered food. The restaurant's famous cacio e pepe, made with a recipe that had been passed down through 3 generations of Roman chefs. He asked her to sit with him while he ate. Just for a moment. Just to talk. She said no. He accepted it with grace. But his eyes followed her all night. And when she brought him the check, she found a $100 bill tucked beneath his wine glass with a note written on a napkin. For your grandmother's medications. Please don't refuse. It would make me sad, and you've already seen enough of that. She should have returned it, should have left it on the table and walked away with her dignity intact. Instead, she tucked it into her apron pocket and told herself it was for Nonna Clara, that it wasn't personal. that she wasn't already falling for a man she'd spoken to for a total of 15 minutes. The third night, she sat with him for half an hour. The manager noticed. He started to approach, his face thunderous, and then something happened that Gianna would puzzle over for weeks. A massive man in a dark suit appeared from nowhere. She hadn't even seen him in the restaurant, and intercepted the manager with a single murmured word. The manager's face went white. He retreated without another sound. "Who was that?" Gianna asked, her voice sharp with sudden fear. "A friend." Luca's expression gave nothing away. "Someone who looks out for me." He scared the manager half to death. Did he? There was something almost amused in Luca's voice. How unfortunate. She should have pressed, should have demanded answers, should have run. Instead, she asked him about his mother and watched the sorrow in his eyes soften into something that looked like gratitude. 2 weeks passed. Luca came to the restaurant every night, always alone, always to the same corner booth. The staff learned to leave him alone. Word had spread about the manager's encounter with the massive man in the dark suit, and nobody wanted to be the next one to make that particular mistake. Gianna sat with him when she could steal moments away from her tables. They talked about everything and nothing. Her childhood in Bensonhurst, his travels through Europe, the books they both loved, the movies they disagreed about, the way the city looked different at 3 in the morning when the streets were empty and the world felt like it belonged to no one. She learned that he spoke 6 languages fluently and could read 3 more, that he'd been educated at the finest schools in Italy and England before circumstances pulled him back to New York, that he ran businesses with a vague wave of his hand that suggested he didn't want to elaborate. She learned that his father had died when he was young. An accident, he said, though something in his eyes suggested the word accident came with invisible quotation marks, and that his mother had followed a decade later, her heart simply giving out one ordinary Tuesday morning while she was making coffee. She learned that he had cousins he didn't trust, and aunts he rarely saw, and a network of associates who called him boss, but never quite met his eyes. She learned that he was alone in a way that wealth couldn't fix, surrounded by people but connected to none of them, moving through a world that saw only his money and his power, and never the man underneath. And she learned that when he looked at her, really looked, with those dark, penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul, she felt more alive than she had in years. "You shouldn't keep coming here," she told him one night, 3 weeks in. "People are starting to talk. Let them talk. I mean it, Luca. The other servers think you're—" She hesitated, heat rising to her cheeks. "They think you're interested in me. Romantically. And is that so impossible to believe?" His voice was soft, dangerous in a way that made her pulse quicken. "I'm a waitress. You're—" She gestured at his suit, his watch, the quiet power that radiated from him like heat from a furnace. "You're not the kind of man who dates waitresses. I'm exactly the kind of man who does whatever he wants." He reached across the table and took her hand, the first time he'd touched her, and the contact sent electricity racing up her arm. "Gianna, look at me." She looked. His dark eyes were earnest, intense, stripped of their usual composure. "I am not a good man. I've done things that would horrify you. I've made choices that can't be unmade, built a life on foundations that would make your grandmother weep if she knew." His grip tightened on her fingers. "But when I'm with you, I remember what it felt like to be good, to be seen as something other than a monster. You're not a monster. You don't know what I am. Then tell me." Silence stretched between them. The restaurant hummed with the sounds of service around them, glasses clinking, silverware scraping, the low murmur of conversation. But in their corner booth, the world had gone still. "My name is Luca Vitelli," he said finally. "My family has run the Vitelli crime organization for 4 generations. I am what the newspapers call the shadow of the 5 families." He watched her face, waiting for the fear, the disgust, the inevitable retreat. "I am a Don, Gianna, and I am falling in love with you." She should have run, should have torn her hand from his and fled into the night, putting as much distance as possible between herself and this beautiful, dangerous man who had just confessed to being everything she'd been raised to fear. Instead, she heard her grandmother's voice in her head, rough with years and wisdom. "Amore non scegli, l'amore trova." Love doesn't choose, love finds. "I know," she said quietly. "I mean, not the crime part. I didn't know that. But I knew you were dangerous. I knew you weren't what you seemed." She turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers together. "And I kept sitting down anyway." Something cracked in his expression, the walls he'd built over decades of survival crumbling in a single moment. "You should run," he whispered. "Probably." She lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to his knuckles. "But my grandmother always said I was too stubborn for my own good." The next month was a dream Gianna was terrified of waking from. Luca didn't just court her, he consumed her, filling every empty space in her life with his presence, until she couldn't remember what it had felt like to be alone. He met her after work with cars that cost more than her apartment building, whisking her away to rooftop restaurants where they were the only diners and private concerts where musicians played just for them, and galleries that opened at midnight because he'd asked, and no one said no to Luca Vitelli. He brought gifts for her grandmother, rare ingredients she couldn't find anywhere in Brooklyn, saffron from Iran, and truffles from Alba, and olive oil pressed from trees that had been growing since before America was a country. A first-edition cookbook signed by the chef whose recipes Nonna Clara had memorized decades ago from a battered copy she'd carried from Sicily as a young bride. A cashmere shawl so soft it felt like wearing a cloud, in the exact shade of blue that matched the Madonna in the painting above Nonna's bed. He charmed Nonna Clara completely. The old woman who trusted no one and judged everyone took one look at Luca Vitelli and declared him un buon ragazzo, a good boy. When Gianna pointed out that he was nearly 40 and ran a criminal empire, her grandmother waved a gnarled hand and said, "So, your grandfather smuggled wine during Prohibition. Nobody's perfect." They didn't talk about his work. That was the unspoken agreement, the line Gianna drew and Luca respected. She knew what he was, knew the blood that stained his hands, even if she never saw it. But she chose not to look too closely. She chose the man who brought her flowers and spoke to her in her grandmother's dialect and looked at her like she'd hung the moon. She chose love over wisdom. She would pay for that choice. The warning came from Nina, of all people. The bitter blonde had watched Gianna's transformation with mounting resentment. The new clothes, the exhausted happiness, the way she floated through shifts like her feet weren't touching the ground. One night, she cornered Gianna in the server station with something other than jealousy in her eyes, something that looked almost like fear. "I know who he is," Nina hissed. "Your boyfriend, Luca Vitelli. I looked him up after I saw his face in the news." "Nina, he's a murderer, Gianna. A monster. The things they say he's done, I know what they say. And you don't care. You're just going to keep screwing the boogeyman and pretending everything's fine." Gianna's jaw tightened. "You don't know him." "I know what he is. And I know what happens to the women who get close to men like that." Nina grabbed her arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "His wife died, Gianna. 5 years ago. Car bomb meant for him. They never found enough of her to bury. The words hit Gianna like a physical blow. Luca had never mentioned a wife. Never mentioned. Oh, God. The sadness in his eyes. The way he'd said no one had seen him in a very long time. "They'll come for you too," Nina continued, her voice urgent. "His enemies. His rivals. You think you're special? You think you're different? You're just another target waiting to happen." Gianna pulled her arm free. "You don't know what you're talking about. I'm trying to help you. You're trying to hurt me. Like you always do." Gianna's voice cracked. "I appreciate the warning, Nina. Really. But what happens in my life is my business." She walked away before Nina could respond, her hands shaking, her heart racing, her carefully constructed denial crumbling around her like a house built on sand. That night, she asked Luca about his wife. They were in his penthouse, curled together on a couch that cost more than her car, watching the city lights sparkle through floor-to-ceiling windows. She felt him go rigid beside her, felt the warmth drain from the room. "Her name was Isabella," he said, his voice flat. "We were married for 3 years. She was killed by a man named Lorenzo Vitelli, my cousin." He turned to look at her and his dark eyes were hollow. "He planted the bomb because he wanted my position. He thought if I was grieving, if I was weak, he could take everything I'd built." His jaw tightened. He was wrong, but Isabella paid for his ambition with her life. "Luca, I couldn't protect her." The words were raw, ragged. "I told her she was safe. I promised her. And she died screaming my name while I watched from 50 feet away." He pulled away from her, rising to stand at the window with his back to her. "This is what I am, Gianna. This is what loving me means. Danger. Death. A target on your back that never goes away." She stood and crossed to him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind, pressing her cheek to his shoulder blade. "Is Lorenzo still alive?" Yes. The word was ice. For now. The attack came 6 weeks later, on a night that had started like any other. Gianna was working a double shift. One of the other servers had called in sick with something that sounded suspiciously like a hangover, and she needed the money anyway. Even with Luca's generosity, she couldn't bring herself to stop working entirely. The restaurant was her anchor, her connection to the person she'd been before. Everything changed, and some part of her knew that if she let it go, she might lose herself entirely. Luca had texted that he'd be late, something about a meeting that couldn't be postponed, important business with associates from overseas. But he'd come by when it was over. He always did. She'd smiled at her phone like a teenager with her first crush and tucked it back in her apron, not noticing the way Nina watched her from across the room with something calculating in her eyes. Not noticing the way Nina slipped into the back office during her break, or the hushed phone call she made with shaking hands, or the way she kept glancing toward the front door like she was expecting someone. The restaurant was quiet by 10 o'clock. Just a few tables lingering over dessert and coffee, the kitchen winding down for the night. Gianna was folding napkins at the server station when the front door opened. 3 men walked in. They didn't look like Vecchio's usual clientele, leather jackets instead of suits, hard eyes that scanned the room like they were looking for something, for someone. "We're closing soon," the hostess said, her voice uncertain. "I'm not sure we're not here to eat." The lead man, stocky with a scar across his cheek, pushed past her. His eyes found Gianna, and his lips curled into a smile that made her blood run cold. There she is. The Don's little waitress. Gianna's hand moved toward her apron pocket, where her phone was tucked, but the man was faster. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and grabbed her wrist, twisting hard enough to make her gasp. None of that. He pulled her close, his breath hot and sour against her face. You're coming with us. Mr. Vitelli wants to meet the woman who stole his cousin's heart. Cousin. Lorenzo. This was happening. This was actually happening. Let me go. Her voice came out stronger than she felt. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know any Vitelli. The slap snapped her head to the side, stars exploding across her vision. Don't lie to me. The man's grip tightened on her arm. We've been watching you for weeks. Cozy dinners, late-night drives. You think we don't know exactly what you are to Luca? Around them, the remaining diners were frozen in their seats, too shocked or too scared to move. The hostess had disappeared, hopefully to call the police, though Gianna knew the police wouldn't arrive in time to matter. Please, she whispered, I'm nobody. I'm just a waitress. I don't know anything about you know enough. The man started dragging her toward the door, and when Luca comes to get you back, Lorenzo will be waiting, just like with the last one, Isabella, the wife who died screaming. Gianna's terror crystallized into something harder, something that felt almost like rage. She'd grown up in Bensonhurst. She'd learned to fight before she'd learned to read, and she was not going to die in some warehouse, used as bait for a war she'd never asked to be part of. She let herself go limp, sagging in the man's grip like she'd fainted. He stumbled, adjusting his hold, and she drove her elbow into his solar plexus with every ounce of strength she had. He doubled over with a grunt of shock, and she was already moving, spinning away, grabbing the nearest heavy object, a wine bottle from the server station, and swinging it at the second man who lunged for her. Glass shattered against his skull. He went down. But the third man was faster and stronger, and when he tackled her to the ground, the marble floor knocked the breath from her lungs. Stupid bitch. He pinned her arms above her head with one hand, his weight crushing her. You think that was going to... The gunshot was deafening. The man's body jerked, blood spraying across Gianna's face. And then he was being hauled off her by hands she recognized. Luca. He stood over her, a gun still smoking in his hand, his face a mask of cold fury she'd never seen before. Behind him, Marco was dispatching the man she'd hit with the wine bottle, and 2 more of Luca's soldiers were restraining the scarred leader. Gianna. Luca's voice cracked as he dropped to his knees beside her. Gianna, look at me. Are you hurt? Did they... I'm okay. Her voice shook. I'm okay. How did you... Marco was watching the restaurant. He called the moment they walked in. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest so hard she could barely breathe. If I'd been 5 minutes later, you weren't. She clung to him, trembling. You weren't. The aftermath was a blur of motion and fear, and Luca's voice giving orders in rapid Italian she could barely follow. His words came fast and sharp, a commanding rhythm that his men responded to without question. And she saw for the first time the full weight of what he was, not just wealthy, not just powerful, but a general commanding an army, a king directing a kingdom that operated in shadows. Men appeared from nowhere, soldiers, Marco called them, and suddenly the restaurant was a crime scene being methodically erased. Bodies disappeared into black bags and then into vans that materialized at the service entrance. Glass was swept up by men who moved with practiced efficiency. Blood was scrubbed from marble floors that had seen centuries of service and would see centuries more, unmarked by tonight's violence. The traumatized diners were escorted out with promises and threats that ensured their silence. And Gianna sat in the corner booth, their booth, With a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, watching her world reshape itself around her. Nina appeared in her line of sight, pale and shaking, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "Gianna, I'm so sorry. I didn't know they were going to. I just told them when you worked. I didn't think they'd actually." The words hit Gianna like a second slap. "You told them. They paid me. Said they just wanted to watch him to. I didn't know they were going to hurt you." Luca materialized beside them, his hand falling on Gianna's shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "You sold her out," he said to Nina, his voice soft, terrifyingly soft. "For money? I didn't know. How much?" Nina's face crumpled. $5,000. $5,000. Luca's grip tightened on Gianna's shoulder. "That's what her life was worth to you. $5,000. Please." Nina was crying now, ugly sobs that shook her thin frame. "Please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. Marco." The big man appeared instantly, his kind eyes now cold as stone. "Take her somewhere quiet. I'll deal with her later." "No." Gianna's voice cut through the tension. Everyone froze. Luca, Marco, Nina, the soldiers packing up around them. "No," she repeated, rising to her feet on shaking legs. "She's not your responsibility, Luca. She's mine." She crossed to Nina and looked at the woman who'd sold her for a handful of cash, the woman who'd warned her about Luca and then betrayed her to his enemies, the woman who'd almost gotten her killed. "You're going to disappear," Gianna said quietly. "Tonight, you're going to take whatever money you have, and you're going to leave New York, and you're never going to come back. You're never going to speak to anyone about what happened here, or about Luca, or about me. Where am I supposed to go? I don't care." Gianna's voice hardened. "But if you're still in the city by morning, I won't stop him from doing whatever he thinks is necessary. Do you understand?" Nina nodded frantically, tears streaming down her face. "Go." Nina fled. Marco raised an eyebrow at Luca, who shrugged almost imperceptibly. The big man's lips twitched, something that might have been approval, and he turned back to directing the cleanup. "That was merciful," Luca said softly, coming to stand beside Gianna. "She almost got you killed." "I know." Gianna watched Nina's retreating figure disappear through the service entrance. "But I'm not you, Luca. I can't have someone's death on my conscience. Not even hers." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her blood-stained knuckles. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me," he said. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not." She managed a shaky smile. "But you're stuck with me now." The smile he gave her in return was fragile and wondering, and full of a hope he'd clearly never expected to feel again. "I can live with that." Lorenzo Vitelli made his move 3 days later. Gianna had moved into Luca's penthouse. Temporarily, they both insisted, until the threat was neutralized, and she was still adjusting to the surreal experience of living in a home with more rooms than her grandmother's entire building. The kitchen alone was larger than her Bensonhurst apartment, all marble countertops and professional-grade appliances that she was slowly learning to use. The closet he'd cleared for her could have held her entire wardrobe 10 times over, and the bathroom had a tub the size of a small swimming pool, with jets and heated tiles and a view of Central Park that made her feel like she was bathing in the sky. Security followed her everywhere, discreet men in dark suits who appeared whenever she left the building and melted into the shadows when she returned. Marco had become her shadow, a massive, surprisingly gentle presence who taught her card games during long hours of waiting, told her stories about Luca as a young man that made her laugh until she cried, and never once made her feel like a burden or a prisoner. But even with all the protection, even with Luca's army of soldiers and his network of informants and his seemingly infinite resources, Lorenzo found a way in. It happened at her grandmother's apartment. Nonna Clara had refused to leave Bensonhurst. "I've lived in this building for 40 years, and I'm not going to let some stronzo chase me out now." And Luca had reluctantly agreed to station guards outside rather than force the issue. But Lorenzo's men were good, better than good. They came through the roof. By the time Gianna got the call, her grandmother was already gone. The ransom demand arrived an hour later. Luca Vitelli, alone, at the old Vitelli warehouse on the waterfront. Midnight, come alone, or the old woman dies screaming. "I'm going," Gianna said immediately. "No." Luca's voice was iron. "Absolutely not. That's my grandmother, Luca, the only family I have left. If you think I'm going to sit here while Lorenzo wants me dead, if you walk into that warehouse, you give him leverage over me. You become a weapon he can use. I don't care. I care." He grabbed her shoulders, his dark eyes blazing. "I lost Isabella because I wasn't careful enough. I will not lose you, too. Then, come with me." She grabbed his hands. "We go together. We find her, we get her out, we end this." "Gianna, I'm not asking permission." Her voice cracked. "I'm telling you, I'm going to that warehouse tonight, with or without you. The only question is whether you're going to help me or try to stop me." They stared at each other, deadlocked, two stubborn souls who'd found each other against all odds and refused to be separated by anything, even common sense. "Marco," Luca said finally, without looking away from her, "assemble the team. We're going to war." The warehouse loomed against the night sky like a monument to decay. Rusted metal walls, broken windows, the skeletal remains of machinery visible through gaps in the structure. Once, it had been the heart of Vitelli operations, the place where Luca's grandfather had built the family fortune. Now it was a tomb waiting to be filled. They approached from 3 directions, Luca's soldiers spreading through the surrounding blocks, cutting off escape routes, taking positions on rooftops and in abandoned buildings. Marco stayed with Gianna in an armored SUV parked 2 blocks away, ready to move the moment Luca gave the signal. "I should be in there," she said, watching the warehouse through binoculars. "You should be alive." Marco's voice was gentle. "Which you won't be if you go charging in without a plan. He has my grandmother, and Luca will get her back. He's done this before, Gianna. He knows what he's doing." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that the man she loved could handle this, that his soldiers were enough, that Nonna Clara would be safe. But the minutes stretched like hours, and the silence from the warehouse was deafening, and every second that passed felt like a countdown to disaster. The gunfire started at 11:47. Gianna was out of the SUV before Marco could stop her, running toward the warehouse with nothing but desperation and a small knife she'd stolen from Luca's kitchen. A paring knife with a 4-inch blade that felt ridiculous against the sound of automatic weapons tearing through the night. But she couldn't sit in that car for one more second while her grandmother was in danger. Marco caught up with her halfway there, his massive body shielding hers as bullets tore through the night around them. She could hear them whistling past, could feel the displaced air as death brushed by inches from her face. But terror had crystallized into something harder, something that wouldn't let her stop. "Stay behind me," Marco growled, drawing his own weapon, a massive silver pistol that looked like it could stop a truck. "And for God's sake, don't die. Luca will kill me if you die. He'll actually kill me. He'll dig up my grave and kill me again." They entered through a side door, into a chaos of shadows and muzzle flashes and screaming men. Luca's soldiers were everywhere, methodically clearing the building, but so were Lorenzo's, and in the center of it all, in a pool of flickering industrial light, stood Lorenzo Vitelli himself. He was handsome in the way of men who'd never been told no, polished, arrogant, with cold blue eyes that swept over the carnage around him with something like boredom. At his feet, bound to a chair, was Nonna Clara. The old woman looked smaller than Gianna had ever seen her, fragile in a way that broke something inside Gianna's chest. But her eyes, her grandmother's fierce, stubborn, magnificent eyes, were blazing with defiance. Ah, there she is. Lorenzo's voice carried across the warehouse, smooth and cultured and utterly devoid of warmth. The waitress. I've heard so much about you. Let her go. Gianna's voice shook. She has nothing to do with this. She has everything to do with this. Lorenzo raised a gun, elegant, pearl-handled, obscene against the industrial decay around them, and pressed it to Nonna Clara's temple. She's the reason my cousin has gone soft, the reason he refused to meet me alone, the reason this is taking so much longer than it needs to. Lorenzo. Luca emerged from the shadows on the other side of the warehouse, his coat torn, blood on his face, a gun in each hand. This is between us. Let them go. Between us? Lorenzo laughed. There is no us, cousin. There's me, and there's everything I'm gonna take from you, starting with the woman you love. He cocked the gun. Time slowed. Gianna saw Luca's face twist with horror, saw Marco raising his weapon, saw her grandmother close her eyes with the dignity of a woman who'd made peace with death decades ago, and she moved. The knife left her hand before she knew she'd thrown it. Years of cutting vegetables in Nina's kitchen, of precise movements and controlled force, translating into something deadly. It caught Lorenzo in the shoulder, spinning him sideways, his shot going wide. Nonna Clara threw herself off the chair, her bound hands somehow finding a jagged piece of metal on the floor, sawing frantically at her ropes. Luca fired. Lorenzo's bodyguards went down. Marco was moving, his massive form a battering ram of controlled violence. And Gianna ran, not away from the danger, but toward it, toward her grandmother, toward the woman who'd raised her and loved her and given her everything. She reached Nonna Clara just as the old woman freed herself. For one precious second, they clung to each other, grandmother and granddaughter, survivors both, while the world exploded around them. Ti amo, Nonna Clara whispered. Now run. They ran. Marco covered their escape, his body absorbing bullets meant for them, his gun spitting fire into the darkness. Behind them, Gianna heard Luca's voice, cold and terrible, and nothing like the man who spoke to her in Sicilian dialect and kissed her knuckles and looked at her like she'd saved his soul. Lorenzo. The name was a death sentence. This ends tonight. Dawn found them on the rooftop of Luca's penthouse, wrapped in blankets that cost more than her old monthly salary, watching the sun paint the city in shades of gold and rose. The skyline stretched before them like a promise. Buildings she'd looked up at her whole life now spread below her feet. A world transformed by love and violence and choices that couldn't be unmade. Nonna Clara was asleep in the guest room, sedated by the doctor Luca had summoned, her wrists bandaged where the ropes had cut, but her spirit unbroken. She'd made Gianna promise to wake her for breakfast. She wanted to cook. Her famous frittata, she said, the one with the peppers and the cheese that Gianna's grandfather used to love. Some things, Nonna Clara insisted, you had to celebrate with food. Survival was one of them. Lorenzo Vitelli was dead. Gianna didn't ask for details. She didn't want to know what Luca had done in that warehouse after she'd fled with her grandmother, what justice or vengeance he'd extracted from the man who'd killed his wife and threatened his family. Some things were better left in darkness, buried where the light couldn't reach them. She understood that now in a way she never had before. "I have to tell you something," Luca said quietly. She turned to look at him. This man who'd walked into her restaurant and changed everything, who'd seen her before she'd seen herself, who'd fought through fire and blood to bring her grandmother home. "What?" "I'm retiring." She blinked. "What?" "Not entirely. I can't. The organization won't survive a complete withdrawal. But I'm stepping back, delegating, building something legitimate that will eventually replace." He waved a hand. "All of this. Because of Lorenzo. Because of you." He took her hands in his dark eyes earnest in the early morning light. "I told you once that when I'm with you, I remember what it felt like to be good. I want to be good, Gianna. Not just with you, for you. I want to build something that doesn't require blood to survive. Something I can pass on to our children without shame." Our children. The words hit her like a wave, sweeping her off her feet into possibilities she'd never dared imagine. "Luca, I know it won't happen overnight. I know there will be dangers, compromises, days when the old life pulls at me. But if you'll have me, if you'll stay, I swear to you I'll spend every day trying to deserve you." She thought of her grandmother's words. Love doesn't choose. Love finds. She thought of Nina's warning. They'll come for you too. She thought of the knife leaving her hand, the blood on the warehouse floor, the way her world had shattered and reformed around this impossible man. "Ask me properly," she said. He stared at her for a moment, confusion flickering across his features. Then understanding dawned and a smile, a real smile, warm and wondering, spread across his face. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a ring she'd never seen before, an antique setting, emeralds and diamonds that caught the sunrise like captured stars. He lowered himself to one knee. "Gianna Moretti," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saw me when I was invisible. You defended me when you didn't know who I was. You showed me that a man with sad eyes could still learn to hope." He lifted the ring toward her. "Will you marry me?" "Yes." The word came out before she could think, before she could calculate the risks or count the costs or do any of the sensible things she'd learned to do in a life built on careful choices. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit as if it had been made for her, and rose to pull her into his arms. They stood there as the sun rose over Manhattan, two people who'd found each other in a restaurant that didn't have a sign, over wine that had gone untouched, and words that had been overheard by accident. 6 months later, Gianna Vitelli walked into Ristorante Vecchio for the first time since the attack. The restaurant had been rebuilt, redecorated, transformed into something even more beautiful than before. A wedding gift from her husband, who understood that some places held magic that couldn't be replaced. She wore an emerald dress that matched her eyes, and Luca walked beside her in a suit that cost more than her old apartment, and the staff who'd once treated her as invisible now bowed as she passed. They sat in the corner booth, their booth, and ordered the cacio e pepe and a bottle of the wine he'd choked on the first time she'd spoken Italian in his presence. "Un uomo con occhi tristi," she murmured, reaching across the table to touch his face. "I called you a man with sad eyes." "You did." He turned his head to kiss her palm. "And you weren't wrong." "And now," he smiled, not the guarded, careful expression she'd seen that first night, but something open and warm, and full of a joy that still surprised him every time he felt it. Now I'm a man with happy eyes, thanks to a waitress who defended a stranger she didn't know. I knew, she said softly, not who you were, but what you were, a man worth defending. She leaned across the table and kissed him, and around them the restaurant hummed with life and light and the quiet magic of a love story that had started with overheard words and ended with forever. If you heard someone speaking about you in a language they didn't think you understood, would you reveal yourself? Would you stay hidden and listen? Or would you walk away before you heard something you couldn't forget? Tell me in the comments.